Welcome to the Barrowan Branch Model Railway. The New South Wales Government Railways named their facilities for receiving and sending livestock by rail, trucking yards. Trucking yards consisted of three elements: holding yards, forcing yards, and loading races. Stock were gathered in holding yards prior to loading. Loading began by working stock into the forcing yards. These eased them into ever tighter groups, until they were in single file as they entered the loading races and onto the wagons. The basic design changed little over time, although timber posts gave way to used rail. I wanted a trucking yard at Tarrawangan, but space was limited. This goods ramp was the most plausible location. Trucking yards near passenger facilities were rare, but not unheard of. The first step was to plot out the facility. This to-scale overlay of the loading ramps demonstrates that a full-scale version of a standard facility would overwhelm the station diorama. The number of wagons that can be serviced at any time is limited, so that gives me the excuse for selective compression of the facility. Reducing the dimensions of the holding yards by 30 to 40% will set the facility into the diorama better. The loading ramp lengths can also be reduced as the yard area is almost the same elevation as the loading dock. I decided to use metal rail posts for the yards and ramps. Although I used timber posts at Barrowan, there's something to be said for variation on a layout. Most importantly, the yard at Tarrawangan, being at the front of the layout, is at risk of accidental damage. I began by setting datum posts in position. The tall post farthest from the camera is for the upper sheep ramp. The posts in the center are for the lower sheep ramp. Posts for the unloading bank fence are at the left. The posts for the upper sheep ramp and working platform have been glued in place. The upper ramp bearers are being fastened to the posts. The posts for the cattle and lower sheep ramps are being set in position. The working platform for the upper ramp is being test-fitted on its bearers. The stockman's gate frames have been attached to the P-gate frame at the dock end of the cattle ramp. P-gates slid vertically between timber runners bolted to the rail frame. Generally, P-gates were fitted at each end of the cattle ramp, although not always. I decided not to add another at the yard end because it would highlight that the ramp is shorter than on the prototype. These timber gates are for the cattle race. Metalwork is represented by hand-cut paper. The two F-gates at the left close the gap between the ramp end and the wagon. The next is a stockman's gate that allows access into the cattle race. On the right is the P-gate. The P-gate, stockman's gate and F-gate are temporarily in place. Cleats have been added to the stock ramps. I made working hinges for the F-gates, using lengths of 0.4 mm rod that are glued in the gate, and bent at 90 degrees. The rod is inserted into short lengths of hypodermic needle that are glued to the rail frame. The forcing yard posts are being set in position. I worked outwards from the ramps to ensure everything lined up. The holding yards will be set out once the ramps and forcing yards are completed. The gates for the sheep ramps are nearly completed. From left to right are the gates for the ramp ends, the ramp entry, and the forcing yards. One set of gates have been fitted to the upper ramp. The posts have been painted dark rust. Railings have been glued to the upper sheep ramp and working platform. The upper and lower sheep ramps and forcing yards are complete. The F-gates, P-gate and frame have been fixed in position. Railings are being spaced and fixed to the cattle ramp posts. The cattle ramp and forcing yard are now complete. The ramp entry and forcing yard gates are hinged like the F-gates. It's time to begin work on the holding yards. The posts on the right are the outer limit of the sheep yards. The 3 posts on the left mark the limit of the cattle holding yards. Following the contours of the existing terrain makes the model appear more convincing. However, the ground falls away too much near the corner formed by the 2 posts nearest the camera. Some adjustment to the terrain is needed here. Ground cover was removed so that the additional material would adhere strongly to the existing terrain. I used medium sifted dirt here, because it finds its own slip angle as real dirt would do when used as fill. Scenic cement holds the dirt in position. The full extent of the facility is evident now that the posts for the holding yards are in place. Before fitting the holding yard railings, I applied a light covering of ground materials to the new work. I began by sprinkling the original ground cover over the area. This is a mix of fine dirt and green foam of several shades and textures. Loose material was brushed to the base of the new bank. Isopropanol was first misted over the area, before applying it more heavily until everything was thoroughly damp. Scenic cement was then drizzled onto the damp ground cover. As those first drops spread out, additional scenic cement was applied more heavily until the entire area was well covered. Compared to spraying, this method affords greater control over placement of the scenic cement to small areas and near track work. There's also less cleanup and wastage. Additional coarse ground foam was sprinkled along the fence line and down the bank. The perimeter fence for the cattle holding yard is now complete. The posts for the dividing fence between the cattle and sheep holding yards have been set in place. Gates are being fabricated for these yards. It's time to get some basic ground cover on the bare plaster before completing the yard fencing and gates. Detailed ground cover will come later. I first brush a thick coat of dirt-colored acrylic paint onto the bare plaster. Fine real dirt is then sprinkled on. This is sprayed with isopropanol, followed by a heavy drizzling of scenic cement. Coarse and fine textured foams are sprinkled along the fence margins. Everything is again sprayed with isopropanol, before more scenic cement is drizzled on. The final element of the model includes 9 gates, the sheep sorting race and short lengths of fencing. These are associated with the road loading and unloading side of the trucking yard, which extends beyond the baseboard. All fencing and gates are now in place. Time to weather everything and to complete the scenic work. I began by applying grey-brown weathering powder to the railings and gates. My aim was to add tonal variation to the grey wash, as well as darkening the timber work. In addition to breaking up the uniformity of the grey wash, I also worked to make the middle railings darker, particularly in the forcing yards and race areas where animals would regularly rub against the timber. Running the brush along the timber deposits the powder into the grain. Dragging the brush across the grain produces water or rust streaks. I used charcoal for the second pass, and focused on getting the middle and lower railings darker on the high-impact sides. There's still more to do with the railings, but I like to do weathering and light passes in conjunction with groundwork until I'm satisfied with the overall look. I began groundwork by adding fine real dirt through gateways and in other areas of high stock movement. I did several passes with the dirt so that the areas of highest movement had most dirt, then fanning out from there in diminishing density. Once the dirt was set in position, I drizzled isopropanol and scenic cement over it. The ground level near this gate is lower than elsewhere, so it would be an area where moisture would settle on the prototype. Being a high traffic area, the moisture would be trodden into the soil, helping to keep it damp and soft. To represent this, I brushed mud-colored powder over the dirt. I didn't want to change the ground texture, merely make it look moist. I also brushed the powder through other gateways and in the forcing yards. Subtle variations in ground cover and color can be seen from the usual viewing angle. Livestock, when confined in yards, tend to group towards the yard center. The result is that the center area and other traffic areas tend to be bare, while closer to the perimeter may still have grass. The less often the yards are used, the greater the grass cover. Various shades of fine and coarse ground foam, and static grass tufts, were added outside the yard fences and ramps. The facility won't be populated. In reality, livestock were not held in trucking yards very long. Additionally, stock movements from small rural facilities would have been infrequent, perhaps weekly, monthly, or seasonally. From a modeling perspective, animals in the yards would reveal the model's level of compression. The three-post escapes now have gates. Thanks for watching.